Juan Rivera did not walk into the police station expecting his life to end there. He was 20 years old, with no history of violent crime, no experience with the justice system, and no reason to believe that an ordinary day would become the beginning of a nightmare that would last decades. What brought him into custody was not evidence, but proximity. He lived near the area where a young girl had been reported missing, and in moments of uncertainty, proximity often becomes suspicion. The disappearance of 11-year-old Holly Staker sent shockwaves through the community. The pressure on law enforcement was immediate and intense. A child was gone, and fear spread faster than facts. Parents demanded answers. Media coverage escalated within hours. Investigators were expected to move quickly, even though they had little to work with. There were no witnesses, no clear timeline, no physical evidence that pointed decisively to any suspect. Juan Rivera was questioned because he lived nearby and had once been seen in the area. That was enough to bring him into an interrogation room. What followed was not a search for truth, but a process designed to produce certainty. The questioning lasted for hours. The same questions were repeated again and again, each time framed slightly differently, each time steering toward the same conclusion. At first, Rivera denied any involvement. He said he did not know the girl. He said he had not been near her. He said he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But denial did not end the questioning. It intensified it. Investigators told him they had evidence they did not yet possess. They suggested that others had already implicated him. They implied that the truth was already known and that his cooperation was the only thing left to decide. As time passed, exhaustion took hold. Rivera had not slept. He had not eaten properly. The room offered no sense of time. Minutes blurred into hours. The pressure was constant, quiet, and relentless. Each denial was met with disbelief. Each hesitation was treated as deception. The message was clear. Silence would not help him. Resistance would only make things worse. Eventually, the questions stopped being questions. They became statements. Investigators described scenarios, asking Rivera to confirm details. They spoke about actions he had never taken, placing him in locations he did not remember visiting. At first, he rejected these suggestions. Then, gradually, he began to repeat them, unsure whether he was recalling something real or simply responding to what was expected. The confession did not arrive all at once. It was assembled piece by piece, a detail here, a sequence there. Each time Rivera repeated something investigators had introduced, it was written down. Each time his version drifted, it was corrected. What emerged at the end was a narrative that sounded complete, even though it had never existed in his own memory. By the time Rivera signed the statement, he was no longer certain what was true. He had been told that cooperating would help him, that admitting involvement was the fastest way to resolve the situation, that the nightmare would end if he stopped resisting. In that moment, the confession felt less like an admission of guilt and more like an escape. What Rivera did not understand was that the words he had signed would become permanent. They would follow him into courtrooms, prison cells, and public records. They would outweigh the absence of evidence. They would define the story long before the facts had a chance to speak. And yet, even at this stage, something was already wrong. The confession described a crime that did not match the physical reality of what had happened. According to the confession, the crime unfolded in a way that seemed clear on paper. Rivera described encountering the girl, following her, and attacking her. The statement outlined movements, actions, and timing. On its surface, it appeared detailed. But when investigators compared it to the actual evidence, the alignment began to break down almost immediately. The physical condition of the victim did not match the sequence Rivera described. Medical findings suggested injuries that required a different timeline and a different set of actions. Certain details in the confession were anatomically impossible. Others contradicted basic forensic observations. These were not minor discrepancies. They were fundamental conflicts between words and reality. Rivera's statement also included facts that had already been publicly discussed, locations that had appeared in news reports, general descriptions that could have been learned from media coverage. What it lacked were the kinds of specific, private details that typically distinguish a true confession from a constructed one. When investigators questioned these inconsistencies, they did not pause the process. Instead, they reframed the narrative. The confession was treated as flexible. Details could be adjusted. Timelines could be shifted. The goal was not to test whether the confession fit the evidence, but to make the evidence fit the confession. For Rivera, the process became increasingly disorienting. Each time he was confronted with a contradiction, he was told he must be mistaken. That trauma can distort memory, that people often forget details of violent events. Slowly, responsibility for the inconsistencies was placed on him, not on the statement itself. The confession was finalized despite these problems. It was signed, recorded, and entered into the case file as a central piece of evidence. From that moment forward, it shaped every decision that followed. Investigators stopped asking whether Rivera was involved. They began asking how to present his involvement. What was notably absent from this stage of the case was any physical proof connecting Rivera to the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers, no eyewitness identification. The confession stood alone, unsupported, yet unchallenged. Once the statement existed, it created a powerful illusion of certainty. To outsiders, it looked like the case was solved. A suspect had admitted guilt. The complexity of how that admission was obtained was invisible. What remained was a simple conclusion, repeated often enough to feel true. Rivera would later say that he believed the confession would end the ordeal, that he thought cooperation would allow him to leave, that he did not understand how the legal system would treat his words once they were written down. By the time he realized the weight of what he had signed, it was too late. The confession had done its job. It had given the case a direction, and it had done so before the facts were fully understood. What followed would reveal just how difficult it is to undo a conclusion once it has been accepted as truth. To understand why the confession should have raised immediate alarm, it is necessary to look closely at the crime itself. Not the version described on paper, but the physical reality of what investigators actually found. Because from the very beginning, the facts told a different story. Holly Staker was discovered in a wooded area near a residential complex. The location was partially hidden, but not remote. It was a place people passed regularly. The timing of the discovery, the condition of the body, and the surrounding environment provided investigators with critical information. Information that should have guided the investigation, but instead was sidelined. Medical examiners documented the injuries carefully. The findings suggested a specific sequence of events. The nature of the wounds indicated a rapid assault carried out in a narrow window of time. Certain injuries required sustained physical effort. Others suggested the presence of tools or actions that did not appear in Rivera's confession. The timeline quickly became a problem. According to Rivera's statement, the crime occurred in a way that would have taken significantly longer than the medical evidence allowed. The confession described movements between locations that could not reasonably fit within the estimated time of death. These were not small errors. They were gaps measured in hours. There were also environmental inconsistencies. The crime scene showed signs of disturbance that did not match the actions Rivera described. Certain marks on the ground suggested a struggle that occurred in a specific orientation. The confession placed events in positions that were physically incompatible with those marks. Perhaps most striking was what the confession failed to explain. There were elements of the crime scene that any direct participant would likely remember. Specific sounds, obstacles, environmental features. These details were absent. Instead, the statement relied on broad descriptions, lacking the kind of sensory memory that often appears in genuine recollections. Investigators were aware of these issues. They had access to the medical reports. They knew the estimated timeline. They understood the spatial limitations of the scene. Yet these facts did not slow the momentum of the case. Once the confession existed, it became the reference point against which everything else was measured. When conflicts arose, they were not treated as reasons to reconsider the suspect. They were treated as imperfections in memory. Trauma was offered as an explanation. Stress was cited. The possibility that the confession itself was flawed was not seriously explored. As the narrative solidified, the crime took on a simplified form. Complex forensic details were reduced to summaries. Contradictions were softened. The version of events that reached prosecutors and the public was not the full picture, but a streamlined story designed to make sense of an otherwise messy reality. In this version, Rivera was the central figure. His confession explained everything, or at least it was presented that way. The crime, stripped of its inconvenient details, appeared to fit. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already there. And they were widening. One of the most critical pieces of information was what investigators did not find. There was no DNA linking Juan Rivera to the crime scene. Biological evidence collected from the victim excluded him completely. At a time when DNA testing was already recognized as a powerful forensic tool, this absence should have carried enormous weight. Instead, it was treated as an inconvenience. Prosecutors argued that the lack of DNA did not prove innocence. They suggested alternative explanations, that evidence could have been lost, that the crime might not have left usable traces, that Rivera's involvement could still be real, even if science could not confirm it. These explanations were presented as reasonable, despite contradicting the physical realities of the scene. The confession, meanwhile, continued to evolve. As new details emerged from forensic analysis, the narrative shifted subtly. Certain actions were minimized. Others were reinterpreted. What mattered was not consistency with the original statement, but consistency with the theory of guilt. Investigators focused on fitting the crime into a framework that supported the confession. Timelines were compressed. Movements were simplified. The complexity of the scene was reduced to a sequence that could be easily explained in court. The real-world messiness of violent crime was smoothed into a story that felt complete. Witness statements offered little clarity. No one placed Rivera with the victim at the time of the crime. No one saw him commit the act. Some witnesses recalled seeing unfamiliar individuals in the area. Others reported suspicious behavior that did not align with Rivera's description. These accounts were documented, but they did not shape the case. What emerged instead was a hierarchy of evidence. At the top sat the confession. Below it, everything else was filtered. Facts that supported the narrative were emphasized. Facts that challenged it were explained away or quietly set aside. This approach created a dangerous feedback loop. The more the case relied on the confession, the less room there was to question it. Each decision reinforced the last. Doubt became harder to introduce without threatening the entire structure. For Rivera, the crime became something he was expected to explain, rather than something investigators were trying to understand. When inconsistencies were raised, he was told they reflected confusion or repression. The possibility that the crime itself did not match his words was never seriously addressed. The gap between the confession and the evidence continued to grow, yet publicly, the case appeared strong. A suspect had admitted guilt. The community wanted closure. The system moved forward. By the time the case reached court, the version of the crime presented bore only a partial resemblance to the reality documented by forensic experts. What remained was a narrative that worked on paper, even if it failed under closer scrutiny. The crime, as it actually happened, was still not fully understood. But the decision had already been made. In a functioning investigation, evidence is meant to guide conclusions. In this case, it did the opposite. The more evidence accumulated, the clearer it became that it did not support the confession. And yet, the case continued to move in only one direction. Physical evidence collected from the scene was carefully cataloged. Fibers, biological samples, and trace materials were analyzed. None of it connected Juan Rivera to the crime. Laboratory reports consistently excluded him. These findings were not ambiguous. They were definitive. The science did not place him there. Investigators were forced to confront a contradiction. If the confession was true, the evidence should have reflected it. But it didn't. Instead of re-evaluating the suspect, the investigation re-evaluated the standards. The absence of evidence was reframed as a limitation of forensic science rather than an indication of innocence. Attention shifted to circumstantial factors. Rivera lived nearby. He was familiar with the area. He had no solid alibi for every moment of the night. These points were emphasized, even though they applied to many other people in the neighborhood. Proximity became probability. Experts later described this phase as a classic example of tunnel vision. Once a suspect is identified, every fact is filtered through that assumption. Evidence is no longer neutral. It is interpreted in service of a conclusion already reached. The prosecution assembled a case built not on what was found, but on what could be argued. The confession was presented as the lens through which all evidence should be viewed. Scientific findings that contradicted it were treated as technicalities. The narrative mattered more than the data. Defense attorneys attempted to introduce the full scope of the forensic results. They highlighted the exclusions. They questioned the reliability of the confession. They argued that evidence should outweigh statements obtained under pressure. These arguments were met with resistance. Judges ruled on what the jury could hear. Some evidence was limited, some context was excluded. The trial became less about whether Rivera committed the crime and more about whether the prosecution's theory could survive scrutiny. As the case progressed, an unspoken rule emerged. The confession could not be wrong, because too much depended on it. If it fell apart, everything else would follow. The system, consciously or not, chose stability over uncertainty. This choice had consequences. Each piece of ignored evidence increased the distance between the case and the truth. Each ruling narrowed the path to correction. What remained was a version of events that functioned within the courtroom, even if it failed outside it. By the time the evidence was fully presented, its role had been transformed. It was no longer a tool for discovery, it was a backdrop. And the case moved forward as if nothing was missing. Years passed after the conviction, but the evidence did not disappear. It waited. Stored in sealed containers, cataloged and archived, biological samples from the crime scene remained untouched by time, even as the people connected to the case moved on. Inside those samples was information more reliable than memory, more consistent than testimony, and more resistant to pressure than any confession. During Rivera's incarceration, forensic science continued to advance. DNA testing became more precise, more widely accepted, and more difficult to dismiss. Across the country, old cases were being reopened. Wrongful convictions were being overturned. The promise of science began to challenge the finality of verdicts. Rivera's legal team pushed for retesting. They argued that newer methods could provide answers that were not possible at the time of trial. Initially, resistance was strong. Courts are reluctant to reopen settled cases. Finality carries weight, but the pressure did not stop. When retesting was finally permitted, the results were immediate and unambiguous. Once again, the DNA did not match Rivera. The exclusion was not partial. It was complete. There was no statistical overlap, no room for interpretation. More importantly, the DNA matched someone else. The profile belonged to a known offender, already incarcerated for a similar crime. His history aligned with the nature of the assault. His presence in the area was established. The pattern fit in a way Rivera's never had. This should have ended the case. It did not. Instead of immediate action, the system slowed. Legal procedures resumed their careful pace. Motions were filed, hearings were scheduled. Time passed. Even with a match pointing to another individual, the conviction remained intact. Prosecutors reviewed the new information cautiously. Public acknowledgement was limited. The confession still existed. It still carried weight. Admitting error meant more than correcting a record. It meant confronting the consequences of past decisions. The man identified by the DNA eventually confessed. His statement included details that had never been released publicly, specifics only the perpetrator could know. Unlike Rivera's confession, this one aligned with the forensic record from the beginning. The contrast was stark. One confession had been shaped to fit a theory. The other fit the evidence without adjustment. Yet even then, the process did not move quickly. The system required certainty, not just truth. Layers of review stood between the facts and their acceptance. Rivera remained in prison as legal arguments unfolded around him. What DNA had done was not free an innocent man overnight. It had exposed a conflict the system could no longer ignore. When the courts finally addressed the new DNA evidence, the focus was no longer on what had happened the night of the crime, but on what had happened afterward. Legal arguments shifted from guilt to procedure. The question became not whether Rivera was innocent, but whether the system had followed the correct steps, even if the outcome was wrong. Prosecutors acknowledged the DNA match but emphasized the original confession. They argued that the existence of another perpetrator did not automatically negate Rivera's involvement. The theory of multiple attackers was introduced, despite the lack of supporting evidence. Once again, speculation was used to preserve a conclusion. Defense attorneys countered with a simple point. The physical evidence pointed to a single attacker. Medical findings supported that conclusion. The newly identified individual had confessed independently, providing details that matched the crime scene precisely. There was no forensic basis for a second participant. Judges reviewed the record carefully. Transcripts were re-examined. Expert testimony was revisited. The contrast between the two confessions was impossible to ignore. One required constant revision. The other remained consistent across time, evidence, and circumstance. Gradually, the weight shifted. The reliability of Rivera's confession was questioned openly. The interrogation methods were scrutinized. The absence of counsel, the length of questioning, and the psychological pressure applied to a young suspect became central issues. The court concluded that the conviction could no longer stand. The DNA evidence did more than raise doubt. It established factual innocence. The scientific record contradicted the original verdict at its core. Rivera's conviction was vacated. After years of incarceration, the legal declaration arrived quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no public apology, just a written order acknowledging what should have been clear from the beginning. He was innocent. Release did not erase the years that had passed. Rivera left prison older, altered by time, carrying the consequences of a decision he had never truly made. Freedom arrived late, and it arrived cautiously. The case triggered broader reflection. Legal scholars examined it as an example of systemic failure. False confessions, once treated as rare anomalies, were recognized as a recurring risk, particularly among young and vulnerable suspects. DNA had done what memory could not. It had spoken without pressure, without fatigue, without fear. It had told the same story every time it was tested. The truth had not changed. Only the system's willingness to hear it had. By the time the case returned to court, it no longer resembled a traditional trial. There was no jury weighing guilt, no witnesses being called to establish a narrative. What remained was a legal reckoning with the past, a process designed not to discover truth, but to decide how much truth the system was prepared to acknowledge. The courtroom atmosphere was restrained. The facts were no longer in dispute. DNA had identified another perpetrator. That individual had confessed. The scientific record was clear. Yet the language used by the prosecution remained careful, measured, and defensive. Words like error and mistake were avoided. Responsibility was framed as procedural rather than personal. Defense attorneys presented a timeline that exposed the collapse of the original case. They showed how the confession had been obtained, how inconsistencies were ignored, how evidence was filtered. Each step was documented. Each decision traced back to a moment where the investigation could have changed direction, but did not. Judges listened with a different posture than in earlier hearings. This time, the evidence did not require interpretation. It required acknowledgement. The contrast between the original theory and the established facts had become too wide to bridge. Still, the process moved cautiously. Legal systems are built to resist reversal. Every admission of error carries implications beyond a single case. It raises questions about other convictions, other confessions, other closed files. Finality is protected not because it is always correct, but because it is stable. When the conviction was officially vacated, it came without ceremony. No dramatic statements, no detailed explanation of how the error occurred. Just a ruling that erased the legal basis for Rivera's imprisonment. The system corrected itself in the smallest way possible. Outside the courtroom, reactions were mixed. Some expressed outrage at the years Rivera had lost. Others questioned how such a mistake could happen in a modern justice system. There were calls for accountability, but no immediate answers. Media coverage reframed the story. Headlines shifted from guilt to injustice. What had once been presented as a solved crime was now described as a failure of investigation and oversight. The narrative changed, but only after it no longer carried risk. For Rivera, the trial was not an ending. It was a transition. Freedom required adjustment. Trust did not return automatically. The label of innocence did not undo the psychological impact of years spent inside a system that had already decided his fate. The legal process had reached its conclusion. The human consequences were just beginning. Life after release did not resemble freedom as it is often imagined. Rivera stepped into a world that had moved on without him. Technology had advanced. People he once knew had aged, built families, changed cities. The years he had lost could not be reinserted into the present. They existed only as absence. Public sympathy was real, but limited. Attention fades quickly. Interviews captured moments, not recovery. The burden of rebuilding fell largely on Rivera himself. Finding work, rebuilding relationships, and managing the psychological impact of long-term incarceration required constant effort. Innocence did not erase trauma. Eventually, the city acknowledged responsibility. A civil settlement was reached, providing financial compensation for the years Rivera had spent imprisoned. The amount was substantial, but it carried an unspoken truth. Compensation is a calculation, not a restoration. It measures damage without repairing it. Legal scholars and advocacy groups examined the case closely. It became a reference point in discussions about false confessions, interrogation practices, and the limits of certainty within the justice system. Training manuals were revised. Policies were reconsidered. Some reforms followed, though unevenly. The case illustrated how easily the system can prioritize closure over accuracy. A confession simplifies complexity. It resolves uncertainty. It satisfies public demand for answers. But when that confession is wrong, it creates a structure that resists correction at every level. Rivera's experience also revealed how difficult it is to undo belief. Even after the conviction was vacated, questions lingered. Doubt persisted in some corners. The initial narrative had been absorbed too deeply to be fully replaced. Innocence, once denied, is not always fully restored. What remained was a cautionary record. A reminder that truth is not self-enforcing. It requires safeguards. It requires skepticism. It requires the willingness to pause, even under pressure, and ask whether certainty has been earned or merely assumed. The case did not end with accountability. No single figure accepted responsibility for the years Rivera lost. The error belonged to the system as a whole, and therefore to no one in particular. This diffusion of responsibility ensured stability, but not justice. Looking back, the most striking aspect of the case is not how it failed, but how normally it did so. Each step followed established procedure. Each decision was defensible in isolation. Together, they produced an outcome that should never have occurred. Rivera's story is not unique. It is representative, a demonstration of what happens when confessions outweigh evidence, when narrative outweighs science, and when finality outweighs correction. The trial ended. The records were amended. The system moved forward. But the cost remained. Time inside prison does not pass the way it does outside. It compresses and stretches unpredictably. Days feel endless. Years disappear without markers. For Juan Rivera, incarceration began in early adulthood and extended into a phase of life that should have been defined by independence, exploration, and growth. Instead, it was defined by routine, restriction, and survival. The psychological weight of wrongful imprisonment accumulates quietly. There is no single breaking point. Instead, there is a gradual erosion of identity. Decisions are no longer yours. Schedules are imposed. Privacy disappears. Over time, a person adapts, not because the environment becomes acceptable, but because resistance becomes exhausting. Rivera entered prison maintaining his innocence. That position carried consequences. Those who do not accept guilt often face different treatment. Access to certain programs can be limited. Parole considerations become complicated. The expectation to express remorse clashes with the reality of having nothing to confess. Years passed without progress. Appeals moved slowly. Legal hope came in cycles, rising with each filing and falling with each denial. This pattern created a specific kind of stress. Not the certainty of a fixed sentence, but the uncertainty of waiting. The possibility of release always present, always delayed. Relationships outside the prison walls changed. Some weakened under strain. Others ended entirely. Family members aged. Important moments passed without him. Birthdays, funerals, milestones occurred at a distance, filtered through brief visits and monitored conversations. Inside, Rivera learned to manage time rather than escape it. He developed routines, reading, exercise, quiet observation. These habits were not chosen for fulfillment, but for preservation. They created structure in an environment designed to remove it. Psychologists who later evaluated Rivera noted signs common among the wrongfully convicted: hypervigilance, emotional restraint, difficulty planning for the future. When years are defined by uncertainty, imagining long-term outcomes becomes risky. The absence of accountability compounded the experience. Rivera was serving time for a crime that the evidence increasingly suggested he did not commit. Yet there was no mechanism to pause the sentence while doubts were examined. The system favored continuity over correction. Each year inside reinforced a truth that would later become central to understanding the case. Wrongful convictions do not end with a verdict. They continue every day the sentence is carried out. And each of those days carries a cost that cannot be measured in court filings or compensation agreements. Release does not reverse time. When Rivera left prison, the years he had lost did not return as opportunity. They returned as absence. Skills that develop gradually in freedom had been interrupted. Social cues had changed. Technology had advanced without him. The world expected adjustment to happen quickly, but adaptation after long-term confinement rarely does. Freedom brought choices, but choices carried weight. Simple decisions required deliberation. Trust was difficult. Institutions that once claimed certainty had taken years of his life. Confidence in systems, promises, and authority did not come naturally. Survival inside had required caution. That instinct did not disappear outside. Employment posed challenges. Gaps in history required explanation. The story of wrongful conviction was known publicly, but familiarity did not guarantee understanding. Some saw a symbol, others saw a risk. Rebuilding stability required persistence in an environment that rarely accounts for lost time. Emotionally, the impact was uneven. There were moments of relief, gratitude, and connection. There were also moments of isolation. People expected closure. They expected gratitude to replace anger, but injustice does not resolve itself simply because it is acknowledged. Relationships required renegotiation. Family members had grown accustomed to distance. Support existed, but it had been shaped by years of separation. Independence had to be learned again, slowly and deliberately. The person Rivera had been before prison no longer existed in the same form. Mental health professionals emphasize that wrongful imprisonment creates a distinct kind of trauma. It is not defined by a single event, but by prolonged exposure to powerlessness. Recovery does not follow a linear path. Progress can coexist with lingering effects. Public attention eventually moved on. New cases replaced old ones. Rivera's name appeared less frequently in headlines. This shift brought privacy, but also silence. Advocacy work continued, but the responsibility to turn experience into meaning was personal, not institutional. What remained was a permanent imbalance. Years had been taken without consent. Their value could not be restored through recognition alone. They existed as a reminder of what happens when certainty replaces caution. The cost of wrongful conviction is often discussed in abstract terms: appeals, settlements, reforms. But its most lasting effects are lived quietly, long after the case is closed. For Rivera, the years lost were not a chapter that ended with release. They were a part of everything that followed. When the case finally closed, it did not do so with answers. It closed with a record of decisions that, taken individually, appeared reasonable, but together produced a result that should never have occurred. This is how systems fail, not through malice, but through momentum. At every stage, there were opportunities to stop. Moments when doubt could have redirected the process. The interrogation could have ended. The confession could have been questioned. The absence of DNA could have halted the case. Each moment passed without intervention, not because no one noticed, but because stopping carried its own cost. Institutions are designed to prioritize continuity. Once a direction is chosen, reversing it requires effort, admission, and risk. In this case, certainty arrived early and hardened quickly. The confession simplified complexity. It offered resolution in a moment of pressure. From that point on, uncertainty became the enemy. The legal framework reinforced this structure. Procedural correctness replaced factual accuracy as the primary measure of success. Appeals were evaluated not on whether the outcome was right, but on whether the steps had been followed. This distinction allowed error to persist without appearing unlawful. The system also distributed responsibility in a way that made accountability diffuse. Investigators followed training. Prosecutors relied on available evidence. Judges ruled within precedent. Jurors weighed what they were shown. No single decision appears catastrophic in isolation. Together, they formed a closed loop. This diffusion creates resilience, but not justice. When responsibility is shared by many, it is owned by none. Correction becomes optional rather than imperative. Stability is preserved, even when truth is compromised. Cases like Rivera's reveal a fundamental tension. The justice system is built to deliver finality, not to sustain doubt. But truth often requires hesitation. It requires the willingness to slow down, to reconsider, to accept uncertainty. These qualities are difficult to maintain under pressure. Public demand plays a role. High-profile crimes generate urgency. Communities want resolution. Media coverage amplifies expectation. In this environment, confessions are powerful because they satisfy a collective need for closure, even when they are unreliable. False confessions are not anomalies. They are predictable outcomes of specific conditions: prolonged interrogation, psychological pressure, and vulnerability. When these conditions are present, error becomes not just possible, but likely. Rivera's case is often described as a failure. In reality, it is a demonstration of what happens when systems value decisiveness over verification and narrative over evidence. What makes cases like this endure is not their rarity but their familiarity. The mechanisms that failed here exist everywhere: pressure to solve, confidence in procedure, trust in authority. None of these are unusual. Together, they create conditions where error can move unnoticed, protected by routine. After Rivera's release, reforms were discussed. Some interrogation practices were revised. Recording became more common. Awareness of false confessions increased. These changes mattered, but they were uneven. Systems evolve slowly, and memory fades faster than policy. For the public, stories like this often end with a single conclusion. Innocence was proven, justice was corrected. The arc feels complete. But correction is not the same as prevention. Each case resolved after years of damage leaves open the question of how many remain unresolved. The most difficult lesson is also the most uncomfortable. The system did not fail because it was broken. It failed because it functioned as designed, prioritizing closure, efficiency, and finality. These values are not inherently wrong. They become dangerous when they replace verification. Truth does not assert itself automatically. It requires space, skepticism, and the willingness to pause. It requires institutions to tolerate uncertainty longer than they prefer. Without that tolerance, certainty becomes performative rather than factual. Rivera's case stands as a record of what happens when doubt is treated as weakness, when evidence is evaluated through a narrative lens, when correction is seen as disruption rather than responsibility. There is no single safeguard that prevents this outcome, no reform that eliminates error entirely. What exists instead is a series of choices, at every level, to slow down, to question, and to resist the comfort of easy answers. The story does not ask for outrage, it asks for attention. Because as long as systems reward certainty more than accuracy, similar stories will continue to unfold quietly, far from headlines, without preserved evidence, without advocates, without a way back. Rivera regained his freedom. The years he lost remain lost. And the question this case leaves behind is not who was responsible, but whether the next system, under the next pressure, will choose differently.